The day my son-in-law stood in my living room and called me Mum for the first time in 11 years, I smiled at him. I offered him sweet tea. I asked if he wanted ice. And the whole time, I was thinking about the folder sitting in my bedroom drawer, the one my attorney had put together over the past 6 weeks. I said, "Make yourself at home, Curtis." And God forgive me, I meant every word of it. My name is Beverly. I am 67 years old. I live in a pale yellow house on a quiet street in Decatur, Georgia, about 20 minutes outside of Atlanta. I have a small garden in the back where I grow tomatoes every summer, even though half of them split before I can pick them. I have a cat named George who has never liked anyone but me. And until 11 years ago, I had a daughter named Simone, who was the best thing I had ever done with my life. I want to be honest with you about who I was before all of this, because I think it matters. I was not a perfect mother. I worked too much when Simone was in middle school. I was a licensed practical nurse, and the hospital ran short-staffed more often than not. I missed 2 of her choir performances. I was stricter than she needed me to be about certain things and not strict enough about others. Her father, my husband Raymond, passed from a heart attack when Simone was 19, and I was still working through my own grief when she needed me most. But I loved that girl with everything I had. Anyone who knew us would tell you that. She met Curtis when she was 26. He was 31, worked in commercial real estate, drove a very clean car, and talked like he had already rehearsed every sentence before he said it. From the very first dinner, something about him sat wrong with me. Not anything I could name, just a feeling. The way you feel a change in weather before the clouds come. He was attentive in a way that felt like performance. He would touch Simone's hand at the table, but his eyes would go somewhere else. He asked me questions about my retirement accounts on our second meeting. Said he was just curious. Said he worked with a lot of financial planning clients and it was a habit. I laughed it off. I should not have laughed it off. They got married 10 months after they met. I was in the front pew. I wore the blue dress Raymond had always loved. I cried because I was happy, and also because some part of me, down deep where you don't let yourself look directly, was scared. For the first 3 years, things were manageable. I saw Simone on holidays. We talked on the phone on Sunday evenings, but slowly, so slowly I didn't notice it happening the way you don't notice a room getting dark until you realize you can't read anymore. She started disappearing. The Sunday calls got shorter, then less frequent. Then she started calling from the car, always in a hurry, always sounding slightly distracted. She stopped coming to Thanksgiving the year after Raymond passed, said Curtis's family had a thing. I understood. The year after that, she didn't come to Christmas either. I started calling more. Curtis would answer sometimes. He was always polite, always had a reason. "She's resting, Beverly. You know how she gets this time of year." "She's been dealing with some stress, Beverly. I'm sure she'll reach out when she's ready." "Beverly, honestly, I think it might be better if you gave her some space. She's asked me to say that." I drove to their house once, in Buckhead, a nice neighborhood, newer construction, the kind of subdivision where every house looks slightly like every other house. I rang the doorbell. I could see the light on inside. Nobody answered. I sat in my car in their driveway for 20 minutes before I drove home. That was 8 years in. 3 more years passed. Then the letter came. It was typed, not handwritten. 2 paragraphs. It said that Simone needed distance to focus on her healing and her marriage. It said she would reach out when she felt ready. It said, in that careful language that doesn't quite sound like the person you raised, that contact from me was causing her harm and she was asking me to respect that. I read it 4 times, standing at my mailbox. Then I went inside and I sat at my kitchen table and I did not cry. I do not know why I did not cry. I think I was too stunned. I called my sister in Savannah. I called my oldest friend, who has known me since we were both 22 and working the same ward at Grady Memorial. I called my pastor. Every single one of them said some version of the same thing. Give her time. She'll come back. You know how marriages can be. I gave her time. 11 years of time. I retired at 63, a year after the letter came. I had my house paid off, thank God, because Raymond had been methodical about the mortgage. I had my pension from the hospital and my social security. I was not wealthy, but I was stable. I had enough. I made a life. That's what you do. You don't stop living just because someone you love has gone quiet. I joined a book club at my church. I started volunteering at the food pantry on Tuesday mornings. I took a trip to New Orleans with my friend from the hospital, and we ate too much and laughed until we were hoarse, and I came home sunburned and feeling, for the first time in a long time, like myself. I thought about Simone every day. That did not go away. It just became something I carried instead of something that stopped me. When I turned 65, I updated my will. My attorney, a steady woman named Miss Ellison, who I had used for years, walked me through everything. At that point, everything was split between Simone and two charitable organizations, a nursing scholarship fund at the hospital where I'd worked, and a domestic violence shelter in DeKalb County that I had come to care about deeply over the years. Miss Ellison asked me, gently, whether I wanted to reconsider the split given the estrangement. I told her no. She was still my daughter. Whatever had happened between us, whatever Curtis had built up in her mind about me, she was still my daughter. A month after I turned 67, I had a small medical scare. Nothing serious, an irregular heartbeat that turned out to be manageable with medication. I was in the hospital for 2 nights for monitoring. I told my sister and my friend, but I asked them not to spread it around. Someone spread it around. I found out later it was a cousin of mine who had stayed loosely connected with Simone through social media. Not close, just the way you stay connected with people now, where you see their posts without really knowing them. She had commented something vague and well-meaning on a post about hospitals, and someone had told someone. 6 weeks after I got home from the hospital, my doorbell rang. I looked through the peephole and I saw my daughter standing on my porch for the first time in 11 years. She looked like herself and not like herself. Thinner. Hair was different. She was wearing sunglasses even though the sky was overcast. She stood slightly behind Curtis, which she had never done before we were married. Simone had always walked ahead of everyone, chin up, like she was already wherever she was going. I stood at the door for a moment. Then I opened it. She said, "Mama." And I said, "Come in." I want to tell you what was happening inside me in that moment, because I think you deserve the honest version. Part of me, a large part, the part that is always going to be her mother, wanted to pull her through the door and hold her and not let go. That part was real. I am not ashamed of it. But I had also had 11 years to think. 11 years of Sunday mornings sitting with my coffee, wondering what I had done wrong, then gradually understanding that the question itself was wrong. I had not done anything that deserved 11 years of silence. I had not done anything that deserved that letter. And in those 11 years, I had talked to enough women at the domestic violence shelter to recognize certain patterns, not always physical. Sometimes just the slow, careful way someone disappears you from another person's life, replaces how they see you, makes them dependent on the story he's told them until they can't quite remember what was true. I had wondered about Curtis for a long time. When Simone said "Mama" on my porch, I was glad to see her face, and I was also watching his. I made sweet tea. I asked about the drive. They had moved to Charlotte 2 years ago. I had heard through the family grapevine. 4 hours, Curtis said. He had taken a day off work. He said it like a gift. We sat in my living room and Simone looked around at everything, the furniture, the photos, the little things that had been in our family for decades. She kept almost saying something and then stopping. Curtis did most of the talking. He said they had heard I had been ill and they had been worried. He said he had always regretted how things had gotten between our families, and he hoped we could put that behind us. He said Charlotte was expensive and the real estate market had shifted and things had been difficult. He said he knew it was a lot to ask, but they were wondering if they could stay with me for a little while, just until things settled. "We'd be so grateful, Beverly," he said. "Family takes care of family." I watched Simone's face while he spoke. She was nodding slightly, the way you nod when you've been told what to agree with. I said, "Of course, you're welcome here." Here is what I had not told them. 6 weeks before they showed up on my porch, around the time my cousin made that comment on social media, which was not a coincidence, Miss Ellison had called me. She had received an inquiry from a firm in Charlotte, asking general questions about estate documents and whether a family member could initiate a review of a will on the grounds of the testator's diminished capacity. I was not experiencing any diminished capacity. I was on a new blood pressure medication and my resting heart rate was slightly elevated. That was the extent of it. Miss Ellison had flagged it immediately. She was not alarmed yet, she said, but she thought I should know. I was alarmed. I called my friend from the hospital, the one who had done the New Orleans trip with me, and I told her everything. She had a nephew who did private investigation work in Atlanta. She gave me his number. By the time Simone and Curtis walked through my door, I had 6 weeks of information. The Charlotte firm that had made the inquiry to Miss Ellison, Curtis's pattern of financial behavior, 2 investment properties that had gone significantly underwater, a judgment against him in Mecklenburg County from a former business partner. Credit card debt I would not have believed if I hadn't seen the documents myself. The real estate market had indeed shifted. He had also made a series of very poor decisions before the market shifted. He needed money. He needed it badly. And his wife, my daughter, was the daughter of a retired nurse who owned a paid-off home in Decatur and had a will that still had her name on it. I had also, in those 6 weeks, had a long and painful conversation with Ms. Ellison about my options, and I had quietly updated certain documents. Not remove Simone, I told you I would not do that, and I meant it, but I had added specific language that made the disposition of my estate significantly less useful as a short-term financial instrument, a charitable remainder trust, conditions on timing, language that Miss Ellison said was perfectly standard and perfectly protective, and I had installed 2 new cameras in my home, one in the living room, one in the hallway outside my bedroom. Curtis did not know any of this. Simone, I was not sure about. That was the part that broke my heart. They stayed for 2 weeks. In the first week, Curtis was charming. He fixed a hinge on my back gate that had been loose for months. He offered to help me organize my filing cabinet. He asked about my finances in that way he had. Careful, indirect, always with a reasonable-sounding reason attached. He mentioned twice that he knew a very good financial advisor in Charlotte who worked with retirees. He mentioned once that houses in my neighborhood were going for significantly more than they had been, and had I thought about whether it made sense to hold on to a place this size? I said I hadn't really thought about it. I smiled and poured more coffee. On the 4th night, I woke up at 2 a.m. to use the bathroom and heard them talking in the guest room. I was not trying to listen. I stood in the hallway for a moment because I thought I heard Simone crying. She was not crying. She was saying, "She's not going to just sign something, Curtis. That's not how she is." And he said, "She's 67 and she just got out of the hospital. She's scared. People make decisions when they're scared." Then he said something I will not repeat here because it is the kind of thing that, once you hear it, you cannot put it back. It was about my age. About how long I might reasonably be expected to need a house this size. It was practical in the way that very cold things can sound practical. I went back to my room. I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark for a while. Then I got up and I sent a text message to Ms. Ellison. I told her I was ready to move forward. In the 2nd week, things shifted. Curtis came to me with papers. He presented them as something routine, a document that would give Simone co-signatory authority on my primary bank account, just in case something happened, and I needed someone to act quickly on my behalf. He had a whole explanation ready. He said his mother had done something similar, and it had made everything so much simpler. I looked at the papers. I told him I would have my attorney look them over before I signed anything. His expression did not change. He was good at that. He said of course that was very sensible, and he set them on the kitchen counter. That afternoon, when Curtis was out picking up groceries, I sat with Simone on the back porch. It was warm for early spring, and the tomatoes I had just planted were still tiny, just starting to show leaves. We sat with our tea, and for a few minutes neither of us said anything, and it felt almost like it used to. I said, "Baby, are you okay?" She looked at her hands. She said, "Mama, I'm sorry it's been so long." I said, "I know." She said, "Mama, I'm sorry it's been so long." I said, "I know." She said, "He said you never really." And then she stopped. I said, "What did he say I never really did?" She shook her head. "It doesn't matter." I said, "I think it does." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, He said you blamed me for your marriage being hard after Daddy died. He said you told people that I was the reason you two fought. I looked at her. I said, Simone, your father and I never fought about you. Not once. We fought about money sometimes, and once about whether to redo the kitchen, and I honestly cannot remember what else. You were never, baby, you were never a burden to us, not for one single day. She blinked. She looked out at the tomatoes. She said, he told me a lot of things. I said, I know he did. We sat there for another hour. I did not push. I just stayed next to her, the way I had learned to stay next to people at the shelter when they were figuring something out that they had been told not to figure out. Miss Ellison came to the house on a Thursday morning. Curtis had gone to the gym. Simone was in the guest room. Miss Roone was in the guest room. Ellison sat at my kitchen table with a folder and walked me through everything calmly and without drama, the way she always did. The inquiry from Charlotte, the financial records we had obtained through legitimate channels, the recording from my living room camera of Curtis explaining to me why I should let Simone have access to my accounts, which, for the record, constituted a textbook example of what Georgia law considers financial exploitation of an elder. She also had paperwork for Simone. Not charges, just documentation. The kind that makes certain things very clear, in writing, when someone needs help seeing what they have been living inside of. Curtis came home from the gym to find Miss Ellison at the kitchen table and a man he did not recognize sitting quietly in the living room. The man was Miss Ellison's associate, who handled certain matters she preferred not to handle alone. I was standing at the kitchen counter. I had made coffee for everyone. Curtis looked around the room and I watched his face go through 3 or 4 things very quickly. He said, Beverly, what is this? I said, this is my attorney, Ms. Ellison. I believe you've communicated with her firm before. He said, I don't know what you, Ms. Ellison said. Mr. Curtis, you may want to sit down. He sat down. I am not going to tell you it was easy to watch, even knowing what he had done. Even with the documents and the recording and 6 weeks of everything laid out in front of me. He was still the man my daughter had spent 12 years with. He was still the father of the child she had lost in a miscarriage I had not known about until Simone told me on that back porch. There is something hard about watching a person understand that it is over, even when it is right that it is over. He was asked to leave my home that day. Miss Ellison advised him, very clearly, about the specific legal exposure he had created for himself, and also about the specific circumstances under which that exposure might become a matter for law enforcement versus remaining a civil matter. He made the choice that people in his position usually make. He took his bag and he left. Simone sat at my kitchen table and cried for a long time. I did not cry. I sat next to her and I put my hand over hers and I let her take as long as she needed. I want to tell you where things stand now because I think you deserve that too. Simone did not go back to Charlotte with him. She called a therapist, one she found herself, not one he had recommended, and she made an appointment for the following week. She stayed with me for 6 more weeks after Curtis left, and we talked more in those 6 weeks than we had in the previous 11 years combined. She told me things about that marriage that I will not repeat here, because they are hers to tell and not mine. I will tell you that they were not easy to hear. I will tell you that there were nights I sat with that information and felt a grief I hadn't expected, not for the marriage, but for the years she had spent inside it, away from people who loved her, told a version of her own mother that I would not recognize. I did not call her baby and tell her it was all fine. It was not all fine. 11 years is not fine. She knew that, and I was not going to insult her by pretending. But she was my daughter. She was sitting at my kitchen table, and the tomatoes were coming in outside, and her father had been gone for too many years, but some part of him was still in the shape of her face. I told her I was glad she was home. I told her we had work to do. She nodded. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, exactly the way she had done since she was 4 years old. She said, "Okay, Mama, I know." The financial advisor, Curtis, had been so eager for me to meet. I never met him. My accounts are where they have always been, in my name, managed by people I chose, protected by documents that I signed when I was clear-eyed and unafraid, My house is still mine, my yellow house on a quiet street in Decatur, with the bad tomatoes and the cat who trusts no one. Mr. Sis, Ellison says there may be further legal steps depending on how certain things develop. I leave that to her. What I know is this: I spent 11 years being patient with a situation I did not create. I spent 6 weeks getting ready for a confrontation I did not ask for. I am 67 years old, and I have buried a husband and worked 31 years on my feet and raised a daughter mostly on my own for the last half of that. And I am not interested in being anyone's shortcut. If you are watching this and you have a family member who has gone quiet, slowly, over time, in that particular way that doesn't feel like an argument but feels like the lights going down, I want you to know something. It may not be what you think. It may not be them. And as someone is trying to get between you and the people you built your life around, document everything. Call your attorney. Don't sign anything at the kitchen counter. And leave the front door unlocked for the person you love, even while you're building a case against the person standing next to them. That is the only thing I know how to tell you. That, and don't let your tomatoes go too long without checking them. The good ones split when you're not looking. I have been thinking a lot lately about what it actually means to be smart. Not book smart. Not the kind of smart that gets you a degree or a promotion. I mean the kind of smart that keeps you standing when someone is trying to quietly pull the ground out from under you. Curtis thought I was not that kind of smart. He thought 67 and recently hospitalized added up to someone who could be managed. And I understand why he thought that. Because I did not argue with him. I did not raise my voice. I offered him sweet tea and asked if he wanted ice. And I smiled the whole time he was explaining to me why I should let my daughter have access to my bank account. That is the thing about people who operate the way Curtis did. They count on warmth reading as weakness. They see a woman who is kind and patient, and they decide she must also be unaware. They do not consider that she might have spent 6 weeks building a case while they were still deciding whether to make the drive. What I want to say to you, and I mean this not as a lesson but as something I had to learn the slow, expensive, 11-year way, is that your instincts are data. That feeling I had at the very first dinner, the one I laughed off because I could not name it, was real information. I dismissed it because I could not prove it. But your gut is not asking you to prove anything, it is asking you to pay attention. I paid attention too late to stop the estrangement. I paid attention just in time to stop the rest of it. Simone is the part of this story I think about most, because she was not a villain. She was a person who had been told a version of her own history for so long that she had stopped being able to find the seams in it. That is what sustained manipulation does. It does not feel like control from the inside. It feels like clarity. It feels like finally understanding something you should have seen all along. The cruelest thing Curtis did was not try to take my money. The cruelest thing he did was take 11 years of my daughter's belief in her own mother and replace it with something that kept her away from everyone who would have told her the truth. What brought her back was not a dramatic confrontation. It was me sitting on the back porch with her and not pushing. Just staying there, letting her remember who I actually was, not who she had been told I was. That is the other thing I know now. You cannot argue someone out of a story they have been living inside for 11 years. You can only be so consistently yourself that the story starts to have holes in it. Patience is not the same as passivity. I was patient with Simone for 11 years. I was not passive. I kept my accounts in order. I updated my will. I called my attorney. I installed cameras. I documented everything. You can hold a door open for someone you love and still lock the windows against the person standing next to them. Beverly is still here. The tomatoes are coming in. The cat still trusts no one, and my daughter is sitting in the other room, making herself at home for the first time in a very long while. That is what I fought for. Not the house, not the accounts. That